There we go. My name is Lori Wasselchuk. I'm the Assistant Director of Public Programming. And if you haven't been keeping track of programming at PAFA, I really hope you can go to our events page and look at what's coming. And I hope if you haven't been to the Rhoden exhibition, Determined to Be, I hope that you can come and experience the exhibition because it is, I would say it's transformative. It's an transformative experience. And that is not just from me, it's from people who I've brought through this exhibition that have never heard about John Rhoden before. It's just a transformative experience. So please come when you can. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Sylvea Hollis is a social historian of 19th and 20th century Black life. She is an associate professor of African and African American history at Montgomery College. Hollis is a native of Birmingham, Alabama, and began her career at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. Hollis explores the intersections of archives, public humanities, and teachings. And you can learn more about her work on our website, and I will include that in the chat shortly. Welcome, Sylvea.
Thank you so much. I very much appreciate it, Lori. Thank you for this opportunity. And I want to say thank you to the whole PAFA team. This has been remarkable seeing how you all have shepherded this work and created a platform for new generations to learn about John Rhoden's work. In particular, I'm grateful for Dr. Brittany Webb and also Anna Marley's assistance in helping to lead this initiative. And I will share my screen and get started. Minimize my, here we go. So today's talk is called Retracing Rhoden's Birmingham, an artist's relationship with his hometown. And I decided to start with this image because it was one of the ones I found the most interesting when I first started working on this project. So I think an interesting way to start the talk is us focusing first on this photograph of these two men and the work in between them. Some things that they have in common: on the right, you see the Reverend Fred Lee Shuttlesworth, leader of the modern civil rights movement in Birmingham. And on the left, John Rhoden, the artist, right? So some things they have in common: they are both they were both born in Alabama. And as they are in this place, which is Rhoden's home studio, his home and his studio, working on a bust for the forthcoming, at that point, opening of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, that sculpture would welcome visitors who came to the museum and also do the work of teaching the visitors that Birmingham had its own civil rights history and its own network of leaders. So these men are from Alabama. They are, despite the fact they were originally from Alabama, they both left. Rhoden ended up settling and living in Brooklyn, and Reverend Shuttlesworth lives in Cincinnati. And I use the language left, which is kind of funny because I oftentimes say they moved, but they didn't leave. And so I kind of want to refine that point. They moved, but they did not leave. Both men remained deeply in the service of their hometown, deeply reflective of what it was like to grow up in Alabama. And it informed much of their work far beyond the formative periods of their lives. A bit about Reverend Shuttlesworth, in case you are not familiar with him. He was born in 1922 in Montgomery County, which is more adjacent to what we call the Black Belt of the state agriculturally rich district, but this was itself, Montgomery County is the capital county of the state. He moved in 1953. to the city of Birmingham and took up the pastorship of a church by the name of Bethel Baptist. And 53 is an important date to note because the following year, we have the Brown versus Board of Education decision, 1954. And Reverend Shuttlesworth had been involved in organizing. He had been involved in strategizing and helping to inform the congregation about what was happening on the landscape in terms of civil rights history. So when he comes to Birmingham, he comes oriented for organizations and very strategically trained in his upbringing, originally as a Methodist, and then became when he became a minister, he chose to join the Baptist denomination. So in 54, Brown happens, and I don't have words for how much hope it created for people in Birmingham, as well as throughout the South and throughout some parts of the North, where there were issues with disparities on racial equity concerning education. And that became a significant marker for Reverend Shuttlesworth's initial activism. We see him working alongside the NAACP. And at the time, Alabama had an NAACP. He became one of the organizers of the membership. He was the head of membership for the entire state of the NAACP until the state of Alabama outlawed the organization. It's impossible to talk about civil rights without talking about the Cold War. And the governor of Alabama at the time, Governor John Patterson, outlawed the NAACP because he called it a communist organization. And his evidence at the time was that the organization was not willing to turn over their roles. And that is a completely different class. So we won't go further into the topic, but understand that justification, that language was used to justify sheltering and closing the NAACP's institutional presence, but not its work. And so the NAACP is outlawed. Reverend Shuttlesworth was at the time over membership. Instead of allowing that moment to be done, he actually leaned on the training of a lot of the women who were integral and important to the movement in the state. So there was a woman in particular by the name of Miss Linda Roby, and she had a phrase that was, "The movement is moving," which means as things happened, so too did the people that were on the side of justice and right have change. Like as change was thrust upon them, it was important for them to continue to change and really transform the shape of what they were doing. And so with Linda Roby's intervention in mind, shout out to Dr. Tara White, who's done work to help establish this kind of legacy and literature on Black women in the civil rights movement, particularly at the grassroots level in Alabama. When we see this happen, Reverend Shuttlesworth, instead of having the organization, of course, just shutter, he and an important network of people that had been affiliated with the NAACP create a whole new organization called the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. And that becomes the vehicle for their activism. It becomes the way by which they protest school desegregations and all of the various institutional aspects of segregation that existed, not just in the city, not just in the state. But it's also important to note, because I think he was born in Montgomery, he also had really strong roots to connect Birmingham with the activism that was happening in Montgomery during the subsequent years, which is this Montgomery bus boycott. And so he's working through this organization that at the time is NAACP, but also merging it with this transformation of ACMHR. And out of all of this work, we see him expanding his movement alongside the modeling of the women who said the movement moves, right? And so I want to say that it culminated their collective activism, Reverend Shuttlesworth and the ACMHR's activism, and another institutional group that became very important in the 60s for the state, the SCLC, which Shuttlesworth co-founded with Dr. King. Their activism goes from having a local presence to a national one, in part because of how successful the bus boycott was. 381 days, people stayed off the buses in Montgomery, and they stayed off as a community of not only Black folks in Montgomery coming together, but Black folks throughout the state connecting with the nation to come together. Shuttlesworth went down to Montgomery, and some of the initial work that the Birmingham movement did was in support of this, making the Montgomery movement successful, helping it be successful. I want to juxtapose that to the gentleman to the left of this artwork. We see John Rhoden, and the question may be, okay, he's an artist, he's from Alabama. What was he doing in the 50s? What was his relationship to all of these just very fixed and well-known institutions within the state? I'm talking ACMHR, I'm talking NAACP, I'm talking SCLC, right? Well, Rhoden is born in 1916, and he's born in Birmingham. And by the time that Shuttlesworth came to Birmingham in 53, Rhoden was not there. He had left. He left in the late 1930s. And in 1955, the same year as this bus boycott, he actually was traveling as a designee with the U.S. State Department as an art specialist in the cultural exchange program. He was traveling all over the world. So from 1955 to 1959, he traveled to at least 20 different countries as an artist. And so he was not home, but he had not left. Like he had family members that were still there. He had friends that were still there. And he absolutely was, as he traveled, very much invested in what was happening on the ground in his hometown. We know that 1960, Rhoden and his wife Rhonda, they purchased a former fire department building, fire station, and they themselves turned that fire station in Brooklyn into their home and studio. And that is the studio that you see Reverend Shuttlesworth in while Rhoden is working on this bus that will become eventually a part of the sculpture that will sit outside of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And it's important to note that as they're purchasing this, at the same time that they're purchasing this home, the movement in the city and in the state is being transformed within the subsequent years by these freedom rides. People in the North going to the South to test out the interstate laws to ensure that African Americans and people of color and their allies can sit side by side on these buses and travel throughout the South. That is happening at the same time. And I oftentimes think about Rhoden and his love of travel, what his relationship to that period was like, despite the fact he is traveling a lot internationally. When he went home, what was that like? I know the archives at PAFA have a adorable photograph of him outside of an airport, you know, and it's like, did he always travel by plane? Like, what was his mobility and his like domestic travel like is a question I have when I think about what was happening with the freedom rides in the 60s. I'll say the interesting thing about this image for me as well is how it came to be. And the rest of this talk will be a part of that, how this moment came to be. I wish I could know what they talked about, but I'm intrigued by their biographies and their stories as a way to potentially imagine what a shared space they had as sons of Alabama that came together in this moment to create work that has continued to be of substance to the city's identity and presence. I'll say I find the letter that John Rhoden wrote to Reverend Shuttlesworth really intriguing. He writes something that suggests he's aware of the archive. He titles it Dear Reverend Shuttlesworth. And then he says, my hometown, Birmingham, Alabama, has bestowed upon me a great honor by commissioning me to make an over life-size bronze of Reverend Shuttlesworth. So he's writing to Reverend Shuttlesworth, and he's also using Reverend Shuttlesworth's name instead of saying you. So it is a kind of, to me, foreshadowing of how historic this moment was for him as an artist who was commissioned to do the work, and also a hope of introducing himself to Reverend Shuttlesworth in a way that lets him know how much he deeply respects him and his role in helping to transform what the city looked like on the other side of the movement. And then he goes through this narrative that's so fascinating about what his questions are for Reverend Shuttlesworth regarding how he wants to be remembered, how he wants to be represented within this subsequent sculpture. I want to say I came to this project through a very fascinating way. In the fall of 2018, I went to a talk at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, and Dr. Brittany Webb was giving a presentation on an artist that I understood to be a Birmingham-born artist, but that I did not know. And so I went to this talk to learn about this Birmingham-born artist. It actually was an Art at Noon talk, similar to what this one is. And so as Dr. Webb is going through this presentation, she gives a generous overview of who Rhoden was, what his professional career was as an artist, how he was trained, and she talked about the work of honoring his archive, which PAFA is doing, and then back in 2018, what all that entailed. What did it mean to do collections care and management on these works that they had? What did it mean to go through the archive that the last hands that more than likely had touched them had been the Rhodens themselves, and to make them in a condition that in which they're accessible to a public for research and understanding of his place within the field of art history, as well as the fields that intersect, right? She talked about the forthcoming exhibition, which we now get to see up, which is stunning. She talked about what kind of staffing support a project of this scale would need, and the significance of the gift coming to an institution like PAFA, America's oldest museum. Like how important it is to imagine Rhoden's pride at knowing that his collection is in America's oldest museum. Midway through the talk, I saw this image of Reverend Shuttlesworth, and it was the sculpture that sat outside of the Civil Rights Institute. And it was at that moment that I as I was watching this, her talk about the process of making the sculptural work, I started thinking about how significant Rhoden's work and his bust and his sculpture of Reverend Shuttlesworth was in my development as a young person, growing up at a time in the state of Alabama where the curriculum did not did not substantively inform students about the dynamic role of the modern civil rights movement and the role in particular that the state of Alabama played, and how I learned that outside of state curriculums, and in moments I also learned it by teachers that were teaching a history that wasn't embedded in state curriculum. And I want to say shout out to Dr. Tundra Loader Jackson for helping me think about that. Like her work talks specifically about the way that Black teachers in Birmingham transgress these kinds of curricular challenges by informing students through a variety of different practices. And this Shuttlesworth bus is one of those examples, like the school visits that became more robust and increased at the Civil Rights Institute after this place opened, which wasn't earlier on, it wasn't tied to components of curriculum in the same kind of way. What was tied to components of curriculum was this image on the left. This is an image of me in the 4th grade in my class going to Montgomery, Alabama, in which we were taken first to the first White House of the Confederacy as a state-sanctioned experience school tour, and then taken to the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And despite the Capitol, and despite the fact that the state capitol is literally a block from Dexter Baptist Church, the site where Dr. King was, the site where the Montgomery Improvement Association had a variety of meetings, that was not on our tour as when I was a young person. And I think I call that out now because we are in a moment of history repeating itself. The question of what the value is of learning from the past if we don't use the lessons we learned from the past, the questions of what does it do to students who learn difficult histories, is a question that is posed for justifications for not teaching more inclusive stories. But I want to call out the fact that it is equally, and it was equally damaging to be taught histories with archival methods that erased the dynamic aspects of Black life and Black history and Black resilience in the state. And so this sculpture represents so much in my development. And the whole time I didn't know who John Rhoden was, which is incredibly ironic. I'll say that it also, it was placed there at the opening in 1992, but it became a formative moment for young people that grew up in the city at this time, because some had been at least introduced to this larger history through PBS's Eyes on the Prize series. And of course, I will say for me personally, Eyes on the Prize and the creation of a MLK national holiday and the movement for the national holiday, juxtaposing it itself with this and the museum created some really rich conversations, very rich conversations at the local level between generations that had not, I'll speak specifically for my family, generations that I had not thought to ask certain questions because I didn't understand wholly what the history had been. And this Reverend Shuttlesworth welcoming people at the front door did a lot of work to be able to help us understand as a certain generation, not just his place, because it's a larger than life oversized figure of this man, but it also becomes a larger than life oversized representation of the movement, the Birmingham movement. And it helps you understand that that was a pre-existing network. So when we look at notes on PAFA's archive, I really want to stress a few things. One is, it was amazing to go through. That was the next thing that I did. The next thing I did after I talked to Dr. Webb. She invited me to look at the collections. I looked at the collections, and I'm walking through, and I see a range of this man's materials. He works with wood. He works with marble. He worked with bronzes. There's some work that looked like it was cast iron, and I'll say my background is I'm a social historian, but I also have a training in museum studies. But most of my museum studies training is like methods of artifact study. And so I'm looking at the materials and very intrigued by like the range of the materials, but I wouldn't have noticed them, to be honest, at scale if I had not seen Dr. Webb's really thoughtful ongoing work of introducing Rhoden to the public before the show opened. So these two art at noon presentations I attended helped me think about what he was doing in completely different ways, and helped me kind of prime research questions around what is place doing for him, what are these materials doing for him. And when it comes to the question of Rhoden's relationship to Birmingham in the PAFA archive, oh my goodness, there's no question this man was incredibly proud to be recognized by his hometown in the 70s and 80s and 90s. There's no question. I mean, this image on the left is it's a news clipping from the Birmingham News, and he laminated it. he or his wife laminated it. They laminated it because it was a thing that it suggests a thing about respect and preservation and of acknowledgement. And so this is what we see. Overwhelmingly, what I see is works within the archive from the 70s, 80s, and 90s about Rhoden's love of coming home to do work, his love of coming home to do research. In the middle, the Birmingham Museum of Art staged the first retrospective on his work in the 1980s, and he had so many pieces of ephemera from that process, be it the catalogs, be it the note cards that were mailed out to people to promote the exhibit when it opened, be it letters from directors about the hope and process of one day having an exhibit at the BMA. And on the right, this is an image of something I noticed when I walked through the original collections that had Rhoden's artwork. And I said, my goodness, is that Dr. Aronson? And through looking through the rest of these photographs, I was like, it is. So this is Mayor Richard Arrington, PhD etymologist, and he was the first Black mayor of the city of Birmingham. And it speaks to a level of detail and care and presence of how Mayor Aronson thought about his role as a mayor at the time that the work was commissioned, that he took so many trips to the foundry and met with Rhoden so many different times about what the artwork would look like, what it would do, what it would mean. And I find that fascinating in hindsight after sitting and listening to these other talks that Dr. Webb did about his training. I mean, to think of man studying for an MFA in sculpture in that first class at Columbia University and traveling all over the world and doing work in Italy, and then having a commission work where his artistic practice is disciplined or trained through conversations with other people who are not themselves artists. And I wonder what that was like for him. So how did I figure out the stuff that is the history before the 70s? We see a lot of different sources help me. The Smithsonian Museum of American Art microfilm had the files on a Rhoden collection that's very rich. There's a few oral history. There's a couple oral histories that were accessible. One by Henri Ganton's really, really rich. There's newspaper clippings, of course, that, not just the ones that he kept, from the 70s of the Birmingham story in the 80s and 90s, but also looking into how he is talked about and what kind of stories are happening before. There's family histories. And when I say family histories, I mean, of course, I found a nephew of his, thanks to some remarkable sleuthing and research assistance from librarian Yadi, who's in the chat, from the Montgomery College, my college, as well as the assistance from the Birmingham Public Library. So like the actual family of his, but also I want to say my family. Growing up in Birmingham, I look at the kind of series of continuity in certain stories. And so Rhoden's parents, Rhoden himself was around the same age as my grandparents. And so, and I'll speak more about how some of my family's stories helped me think about some of the things I read in his oral histories, help me understand, contextualize, consider. It's not a one-to-one, but it's layers of information. It became a kind of layering process of understanding this milieu. What's this climate like overall? And then, of course, the landscape of Birmingham. I visited home often. I walked the streets often. I drove around his neighborhood. I looked at space and place as a city, as a great scholar from Birmingham talks about. And so a part of the work is leaning on this kind of historiography of the city. How has the city been remembered? How has it been written about by scholars? Of course, Birmingham is known overwhelmingly by a lot of scholars as a New South city. That's a city founded after the end of the Civil War. And that scholarship abounds. It's looking at it through the lens of labor history. We had a remarkable history of interracial union organizing, working class activism, and also this the scholarship that exists on community building, what Black life looks like, what African American community look like, and the memory and legacy of the civil rights movement looms very, very, very large in our city, and not just in our city, but nationally and internationally. In many ways, the photographs that were taken in downtown Birmingham during the protests of 1963, which I'd be remiss if I didn't say this is a major anniversary of those events. Those photographs have become stand-ins for the entire narratives of the movement, like what it was about, what it represented. And so that scholarship is really rich and robust, and it also calls upon the question of our responsibility to think of where other places are where people had prior activism, and or how sometimes memorials can obscure, sustain the ongoing work for equality. So there's a lot of scholarship on that as well. And these biographies there's so many biographies that have been written about people from the city that are incredibly helpful. So sorry. I'm looking at the thread and I'm realizing I am using acronyms like a historian. So I want to back up a little bit. What's BMA? BMA is the Birmingham Museum of Art. What's MLK? MLK is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s recognition of his birthday, which was a real struggle and a fight to have happen as a federal holiday. What's SCLC? SCLC is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was formed of leaders of particularly a group of network of primarily ministers at the helm, but of course it's this motley network of grassroots activists that are the tentacles, you know. Let's see. So these biographies help to add another layer to the way that we think about this moment. I'm checking my time. Okay, we're okay. Rhoden's Birmingham. So for those of you who have never seen the city, this is it. And I like this version of the city because it allows space to do a lot of teaching about the landscape and what it means. So the photograph itself is taken from probably a little bit above Red Mountain. Red Mountain is called Red Mountain because of the richness of the iron ore in the soil. It literally looks red, which explains something very important and significant about the city's early history. For a very long time, people thought that nothing would grow here because of all the minerals in the soil. And they pre-mining at a scale, pre-understanding what was actually amazing about the soil, people called it the Behrends. So in the 1870s, 1860s, it was literally called the Behrends. Like nothing's growing there. There's not a lot of big plantations. There's not a lot of urbanizations. There's not a lot of population whatsoever. And so this view is on the ridge of the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, and which is
Hi, Sylvia. I think you're frozen. You're on mute.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob.
Okay, great. Awesome. Okay.
It looks like the internet, we lost her, so I'm sure she'll come back in shortly. There we go.
Sorry, people. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yeah, we lost your signal for a bit.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh man. So understand that this is Enon Ridge. And at the foothill Enon Ridge, you had the community of Smithfield, and there's a lot of rich history and culture in this little circled area. I would love at another point to go on and talk about some of the more famous people that also are from and settled in this place, and the important history of that community. But I also am looking at time, and I want to make sure that we have some time for Q&A at the end. So I will keep moving. So Rhoden is from this area, and something important about it, beyond the community and the history that I talked a little bit about, is its proximity to downtown. And so, I mean, his childhood, he was in a motley community, a place that had, it was segregated, but it also had a by foot, if he would travel by
Thanks all. I'm gonna, as soon as we get Sylvia back, Sylvia. Yeah, we lost her again, but just let's, she should be back shortly. I may just suggest that, she turns off her video so we can hear, wait. She turns off, yeah, I think she could. Let's see, Sylvia?
I think what I want to do cautiously is just keep presenting, but maybe I won't share my screen yet. Because I just in the unfortunate event that the I don't know, I'll just keep telling the story. And if there's space and time for me to at some point bring my visuals back, I will, but I just don't want to risk it. Um, so he's close to the Fourth Avenue Business District. There's music, there's culture, there's the Fraternal Association buildings, which is housing a lot of the Black professional class office spaces. The top of a lot of these fraternal buildings, you have actual entertainment centers like dance halls. There is a vibrant culture in this region. And I also have to stress it is segregated, right? And so it is a world within a world, and yet it also is a space of infrastructure designed for inequality. It is a place where Black folks can actually find a restroom and publicly use it. If you go into the larger part of the city where these restaurants were, lunch counters, when you went shopping, you could not try on clothing. You could not, if you bought things, you couldn't return the clothing in the white business district. You couldn't go to the restroom. If you bought food, you couldn't sit down and eat it. There was the sidewalk politics of what it was to occupy space on sidewalks, what it was to give direct eye contact. There was a whole layer of customs associated with Jim Crow that were normalized by violence. And it's important to talk through what that was like for him in his formative stage. And yet also, Rhoden's biography is fascinating because when you look at his oral histories, he's oftentimes telling stories that defy what we think about and what we commonly associate with growing up in segregated Jim Crow Birmingham. He talks about going over the mountain and dining in houses, not of like, with his quote unquote friends. He learned the craft of being a sculpture artist from a white artist who took him on as an apprentice. He said that often tells a story of how his grandfather had an automobile, and there's a visual I usually show of the Sanborn map. Sanborn map shows the exact, it's an insurance map that shows what the structures look like on his block. And on the Sanborn map, you can see clear as day, not just the size and size of the property, which is pretty impressive for this time period. You also see his family had a garage. There's like this marker that says A, which means automobile shed. And so this car created a kind of mobility, he articulates that it does. It creates a kind of mobility that was not common. And he explains that that is why he could go over the mountain and you know, dine in people's houses. And that explains why he had access to certain things. I want to say that I'm intrigued because so much of his story is, you can tell Rhoden really cared about the archive. You could really tell he cared about the archive. And so there's times when he, you know, tells the story of when I was a child, the first thing that I was, you know, essentially born to be a sculptor. There's times when he talks about the love of the soil and how special the soil was and how he remembers playing with this red clay and molding it and taking it home, and then it dried and became brittle, and then he went back to this same little hill. And I love thinking about this hill and Enon Ridge, this community that he's in. And he says he makes it muddy again, and then he brings some more clay, and he says that's how he fell in love with the artistic process, the practice. As a young boy playing with mud, you know, something that is so formative, and yet he narrates it in a way that is so intentional. And then there's other times when he suggests that how in the world could I imagine being a sculptor? How? What is that? You know, I'm from Birmingham. That wasn't a dream of mine. And so it's really interesting to hear and notice the moments that he exhibits a kind of, he wants to emote a kind of childlike wonder, not him as a grown man, but reflecting back on what it was like to be a child with wonder and love of just this tactile process. And then there's other moments where he wants to remind people of how difficult it was to think and dream about art amid a larger system of Jim Crow. He provides a fascinating space of balance to look at and think about that. I'm gonna try the slides. We'll see how this goes. How much time do we have? Oh, just a couple minutes. So just a couple minutes. I want to show. Sorry, y'all. I wanted to show this because when I say Birmingham was a new South city, I genuinely mean like it also is a Reconstruction city, which people don't talk about commonly together. I mean, historians do, but it's not commonly put side by side. And what that means is, out of the end of the Civil War, we see the city being founded in 1871. Well, by the time Birmingham is founded, we have newly minted within our Constitution this second establishment of a Constitution, a refinement of the issues that were part of the first. There was substantive issues in the first Constitution. It preserved slavery in a myriad of ways. And not just a slavery of incarceration, which we still live with today. We live with the slavery of incarceration as a byproduct in the Constitution. But the earlier one, U.S. Constitution, it normalized even like the idea of capturing few people that ran away seeking freedom, federally using the arm of the government to bring down people seeking freedom. It federally secured militia status and all of this for people that were wanting to tamp down on a slave uprising. So what we see with this new Constitution is three formative amendments that are so significant to not just us then, but us even more so now. The 13th Amendment, it is freedom except for cases of incarceration. 14th Amendment grants citizenship, due process, birthright citizenship. It is an expansive understanding of citizenship, not a limiting one. There are ways in which if you follow some of the legislation that happened subsequently, you see over time the Supreme Court showing how large the 14th Amendment is, how malleable it is as a process of recognizing citizens, and the 15th, which is access to the ballot. So these things are secured, newly minted, fresh. And then we see the federal government, out of a moment of a deal, create a very damaging consequence for African Americans. We see the federal government remove its troops that had been there from the Civil War. And this work was actually from a Birmingham newspaper from 1875. It's housed in the Library of Congress, the original now. And it says, "Shall we call home our troops? We intend to beat the Negro in battle of life, and defeat means one thing. Defeat means one thing, extermination." That's what this ran. And it said it in 1875. And I offer it, you may say, well, what is this Rhoden? This is Rhoden. But no, this is Rhoden's hometown. This is about Rhoden's hometown, and it's also about our nation. This moment that the federal government removed its troops from Birmingham and from the South resulted in a cycle of battles over what is freedom, who's deserving of it, what is citizenship. And it also meant that it became much more harder for people that were fighting, like Reverend Shuttlesworth, like Rosa Parks, like Lucinda Roby. It made it much more harder for them to be on the side of equality, expand the equality rights argument, because the federal government had removed itself from their space of protection. And so that is Rhoden's Birmingham as much as the rest. So this is the Sanborn map that shows his community. Oh, I'm looking at time. Sorry, you all. I want to say that what culminated for Rhoden in this moment of telling his story is when he was invited to Birmingham in the late 1970s, in the early 1970s through the 80s and the 90s. And there's so many beautiful newspaper clippings that he kept where he privately told various stories about child's play with wet clay forming his career.
Hi, how are you?
Oops, sorry. Yeah. So I think I want to close by saying, as was the moment of significance for him, to have this work shown at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute in the front, he also wanted to give the Institute temporarily a loan that would further expand the story that they were telling. And he loaned for a brief period of time another work called The Slave Ship. And this work was at the Institute during a period of its opening. This is Mayor Arrington with it. This is Rhoden himself with this work. And it's an important intersection of a full story moment. If you look at what was happening in the 90s when this work was created, it stages differently in these different places. For Rhoden, he often talked about the point at which he met Hale Woodruff at Talladega College, while Hale Woodruff was working on the Amistad mural. And in some ways, this is a homage to that moment, potentially, because it is Talladega, this HBCU that's right down the road, and it gave him one of those original opportunities to study beyond high school. And then you also see it staged later in an exhibit in his hometown, his second hometown, Brooklyn. And at the time, the New York City was grappling with the question of how to tell stories that preserve slavery amid the attempts to erase the history of slavery. I'm talking about these bodies that were found in Wall Street, that were found all over parts of New York, these African burial grounds. And Rhoden himself served on a commission project tied to the African burial ground in New York. And one of the artists that did a work to memorialize the bodies that were found in New York at the time was a man by the name of Lorenzo Pace, another Birmingham-born artist who settled in Brooklyn. And Pace is important, as well as Reverend Oliver, another Birmingham-born activist, Birmingham-born individual who settled in Brooklyn, because their voices were some of the first ones I found in the archive that suggested how important it was that we not forget who Rhoden was and what he did. So there was a major event, a memorial, and these two quotes, I took these from a Daily News article. One which Pace said he would like to see a major museum hold a retrospective in Rhoden's honor. And he said that because at the time, the only way to see Rhoden's work was to go to the studio, his home studio, and receive a tour. And he said he deserved something so much bigger. And the other, Reverend Oliver, who was a civil rights activist, also settled in Brooklyn, and also a Presbyterian. I forgot to talk about Rhoden's ties to the Presbyterian Church. But he wanted to memorialize as one of Brooklyn's finest, as people that had migrated and settled in his new place. He wanted him to be remembered as one of the finest. So I'll say in closing, thank you all again. And we have some time for questions if folks have questions.
That's great. Thank you, Sylvia. Yes, we do have time. And there's one in the chat that I want to, I have a feeling people are going to want to say a lot here. But what connection, if any, does the presenter see between Birmingham as a center of iron and metal production, symbolized by the Vulcan, and Rhoden's sculptural ambitions?
That's a great question. I didn't talk about Vulcan, but for folks that aren't familiar, Vulcan is a very large cast iron statue that sits atop Red Mountain. And it was done in 1904 for the World's Fair to introduce the world to Birmingham's very wealthy mineral resources. And there's so much that could be said. I don't know about the materials. I do think that I noticed that, and I want to be real about I noticed. The interesting thing about learning about Rhoden through previous scholarship, like these previous art talks, is I want to acknowledge that there's conversations about how he used his materials. He used these materials, the materials of place, everywhere he went, So if he, like, for example, he's using the soil of Birmingham, he's using, I do think, metal and forging and this industrial city played a significant role in some of his earlier work. His grandfather was an engineer, could have become an engineer if he lived in a different time period, a railroad engineer if he lived in a different time period, but he did a lot of work with trains and industry, and so he was industrially minded. And there's actually a newspaper, I don't know that I shared this one. It's great. That's a really great question. Did I? No, there's one where he says the Birmingham News, I think I maybe saved that one for another time. The Birmingham News runs this article where they essentially said he looks like a railroad worker, but he's a sculptor. That was a title, something like that. And so this idea of growing up amongst so much industry, I think, is something he took pride in, that he did this industrial work through the lens of art and art making. And his pride in his father meant that he didn't view it in a diminished way at all. He saw the value of both.
This one's a big one. Genevieve, thank you, Genevieve. How did Rhoden's collection of artwork come to PAFA? And I don't know if you want to answer that, or if Brittany would like to just briefly, because it's a long, incredible story.
Yeah,
I think it's important to talk about.
I don't want to misrepresent PAFA because I don't feel like I'm if that makes any sense.
No, that's no problem. And that that is a curator question. Let me know if I'm having sound or video issues. So the quick version of that is there was an article in the New York Times in 2015 that profiled a number of museums that were doing exhibitions on overlooked African-American artists in the 20th century who were sort of finally getting their attention. And the executor of the Rhoden estate, who was a lawyer who had been friends with John and Rashonda Rhoden while they were alive, read this article. And his name is Robert Anger. He is recently passed, may he rest. But he read this article PAFA was one of the institutions featured in the article, but he called every institution that was featured in the article, all the museums that were doing these great shows. PAFA had the Norman Lewis retrospective up at the time. And he was essentially calling all of these museums saying, hey, I have a house full of sculptures by this incredible artist, John Rhoden. He's no longer living. His wife is no longer living. They had no children. They left this incredible house full of work. Would you be interested in taking on this, these 300 sculptures? And most of the institutions did not return the phone call. PAFA returned the call, and that was the beginning of figuring out this sprawling project, which has the ultimate goal of doing this exhibition, producing this research about John Rhoden and distributing the vast majority of the sculptures that were left in the Rhoden's 4-story Brooklyn home to museums and collecting institutions around the country / world, as a way just to solidify his legacy as an artist.
Dennis, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Thank you, Brittany. Such an incredible story. I'm always inspired.
Yeah, it really is. Thank you all. This is great. Sylvia, great presentation. I'm not sure who could answer this, but I've always been curious. Is there any particular reason why Rhoden did not come to PAFA? I always wondered that.
I can't speak to that, but I will say that I thought it was interesting that one of the Birmingham Museum of Art curators, I think it was Murray, visited his work when it was in Philadelphia, and it was at AMP at the time, in the early 1980s.
And I'll feel that one also. I have a hunch that part of it was, Rhoden moved to New York in the late 1930s. And when he moved to New York, he falls into these networks of Black artists and intellectuals associated with the Harlem Renaissance, served in the military in World War II. And I think, thinking about going to art school after being a veteran who has GI Bill benefits and maybe can explore some schooling, I think it's hard in the mid-century to get an artist working in New York to leave New York. I mean, I think it sort of makes sense for him to stay in New York where his networks are and attend Columbia University. In a way that just, if I think about New York in the 1950s, I think it sort of makes sense for him to stay in New York rather than to leave and go to Philadelphia.
And just to follow up on that, Brittany, I agree. And I think it would be different if he had been older and maybe around the turn of the 20th century. There was some really great sculpture instructors in very early 20th century at PAFA that probably people would have wanted to come study with. And by this later period, after the Harlem Renaissance, it makes sense that an artist would want to go to New York, and particularly a sculptor, and not be at PAFA.
And Elaine Locke is snatching up all the amazing Black artists for the Renaissance.
Facts.
Although in this case, I would say it's really probably Richmond Barthé that is key here, who was his New York mentor / studio mate.
Brittany, there was a question about conservation. I'd love it if you could answer that for folks.
Sure. Let me find the conservation. Let me see if I can find a conservation question. Okay. I see Kathy asks, the Rhoden work looks in mint condition. Did you need to do conservation for this exhibit? Yes, years and years of conservation treatment took place for this exhibition. And I appreciate the question because it's one of the larger parts of this project. We worked with Adam Jenkins Conservation, who did amazing work pre and during COVID on approximately 70 sculptures that are on view in the exhibition, and also just recently gave a great tour of the exhibition, sort of from the conservator's eye view of the work. So yes, the work does look in mint condition, but it did not look that way in 2018. And I think the fact that Adam and his team treated the sculptures so generously in a way that is so necessary so that you can actually see what the artist was doing. And we talked about that a lot on his tour here a few weeks ago. But yes, shout out to conservators everywhere.
I know it's 1 o'clock, but there's one more question, and I think we should answer it. Rhoden is traveling extensively during a time of global independence, anti-colonialism movements. Does he write about this?
I haven't seen signs of him writing about it explicitly. I've definitely seen him commenting on the artistic practice of studying kind of pre-colonial art methods in places where he went. But I've seen that in various interviews, him referencing that. But I don't know of him inserting himself into discourses about decolonization formally.
I think, you know, the writing that I have seen done here is mostly in the letters between John and Rashonda when, you know, at various points where they were traveling together and when they were traveling apart, with the exception of there are a series of news articles or international news articles in the midst of this where I can't remember where they were off the top of my head, but there was some sort of dust up around, you know, I think John and Rashonda had made some comments when they were on a trip abroad about sort of self-determination or self-rule that had gotten that were not well received locally. And the response was sort of like, you know, well, what do these Americans know? Perhaps they should actually just mind their business, was the sort of feel of that, the receipt of their comments, which suggested that they might have had some pro-independence opinions.
Okay, they're just really good questions. I just have to ask this last one, you guys, and thank you all for coming. If you have to go, I understand. But is there any curatorial work being done on connections between Rhoden's work and traditional African methods, which he seems to be aware of?
Yes, and that's one of the areas of interest. It is an area that sort of fell out of this version of this project a little bit, but I'm hoping that the next major exhibition of work by John Rhoden is accompanied by a publication that includes several scholarly essays on that. I'm calling it now. This is the first of many.
Yay! Put it into the world and it will happen. Sorry, Anna, go ahead.
Just we might want to mention that the show is traveling to Birmingham.
It is. It will be at the Birmingham Museum of Art next fall, in fall 2024. So if you have seen it at PAFA and you would like to see it again, please check it out at the Birmingham Museum of Art next year. If you miss it at PAFA, we are up until April 7th. But if you miss it at PAFA, please go to the Birmingham Museum of Art in October 2024, where you will see this work on view in Rhoden's hometown once again.
Thank you all. Thank you, Sylvea, Dr. Hollis, as Han definitely wrote. Everybody's so appreciative in the chats. Thank you, Brittany. And I hope to see you next week. If you can come back, another scholar who Sylvea is one of our authors in our catalog, forthcoming. And Greg Barnheisel, who is also a scholar in the Rhoden catalog, forthcoming, will be here next week. And he will be talking about Cold War modernism and how Rhoden, Sylvea mentioned it a little bit, his work as traveling the world for the Department of State. Greg's going to talk a little bit more about that whole idea. And it's going to be fascinating. So thanks again for coming today. Thanks for participating in all your great comments. So beautiful. And everybody have a beautiful week.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Take care.
Thanks so much.